woke thinking is incredibly regressive. It rehabilitates racism, it rehabilitates sexism, it rehabilitates homophobia. That there is an incredible authoritarianism behind it. I think they're never happier than donning the lanyard, telling other people what to do. Why is it acceptable to march through the streets of London making anti-Semitic statements, but you can't even name the group of people who are responsible for raping 12-year-old girls? I think that's the double standard that we're facing.
Joanna, you wrote a book entitled How Woke Won. Do you still think it has?
That's a very good question. And certainly lots of people have been commenting on the vibe shift that's occurred since Trump's victory in the US. And I guess also we can add to that now the electoral success of reform in the UK. It suddenly seems as if the Labour Party is changing its tune on a number of issues, most notably immigration. But to go back to my book, I mean, I think the title was always perhaps a bit misleading, if I dare say that about my own book, because what I was arguing was that woke had won a victory amongst the cultural elite, we could say, so had come to dominate institutions like academia, schools, the NHS, the legal system. And it was very much a kind of technical elite victory. But I don't think woke had ever gained ground amongst the mass of the population, if you like. Most normal people knew that men were not women, and know that even now the Supreme Court has confirmed what they knew all along. So it was a very peculiar victory. So when I said woke has won, what I meant was it's come to dominate these elite institutions. And now, even though I think there is a notable vibe shift and there is some pushback on woke, I've already mentioned the Supreme Court ruling on gender. I think you can see as a result of Trump's victory some rollback on DEI policies within multinational corporations. And there's various things we can point to where the kind of excesses of woke are being challenged. But I would still maintain that we have a huge problem with woke thinking dominating within our cultural institutions. So within museums, art galleries, the film industry, the BBC, academia, our education system. I would still say that within all those cultural institutions, woke thinking is still very, very dominant. And these people are very powerful because they're running these cultural institutions. And I think they're not prepared to give up without a fight. I think that's why I would still say we have a long, long way to go before we can declare woke to be over. But I think also when we talk about woke, when I talk about woke, it's one very small word, just 4 letters, 1 syllable that encompasses a whole plethora of different ideas that we're getting at when we kind of hint with that word at what we're meaning. And I think lots of the important underlying ideas, so I guess to be more specific, I'm talking about identity politics, but I'm also talking about a tendency to group people into a kind of hierarchy of victimhood and award kind of privilege and oppression to people based on group characteristics. I think that those tendencies have not been challenged. I think that kind of those ideas, a kind of victimhood culture, if you like, and a belief in identity politics, even when people talk about rowing back on the excesses of DEI, those ideas that actually underpin woke are still, I think, very dominant in our cultural institutions.
And of course, what hasn't changed are the actual laws relating to what we're allowed to think and say. The cops are still putting people on non-crime hate incident databases. This government's going to introduce shortly an official definition of Islamophobia to make it easy to prosecute people who criticize Islam. There's going to be a law, incredibly, to stop parents and psychotherapists having conversations with trans children and patience and do anything other than affirm their desire to try and change sex. So legally speaking, the state is still pushing this agenda, isn't it?
I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right. And I think what worries me is that it's almost as if that can go hand in hand with a rhetorical critique of, like I said, the excesses of woke thinking. So you can have Starmer making a speech, which I have to say was to my mind, quite sensible about us Britain risking becoming an island of strangers. For example, I thought the things he said in that speech were sensible. And what surprised me about it really was just his use of the future tense. Suddenly you go to towns where I grew up, like Middlesbrough in the northeast, and I would say it's not a question of becoming an island of strangers. We are an island of strangers in places like that because of the sheer flux of people, the sheer numbers of people who've moved in a very short space of time. These are sensible things to say. But I guess what concerns me is that this rhetorical pushback on the excesses of woke can actually sit hand in hand with the exact legal processes that you're referring to. We can have laws, tighten up laws on hate speech, for example, at the very same time as appearing to ease off on the excesses of woke, and actually it risks lending moral legitimacy to increasing censorship and increasing more woke regulation on people's lives at the very same time as you appear rhetorically to be doing the opposite.
I'd be interested to know how you define woke ideologically as somebody coming historically from what I call the classical left, classical Marxism, because a lot of people who are anti-woke, like say James Lindsay, who I'm broadly a fan of, I think he's done a lot of important and good work in this area, but he would argue that woke / new left identity politics is a transposition of classical Marxism, that it operates according to the same operating principle of group conflict with a revolutionary, fantastical objective. And I'd be interested to know if you have a different interpretation or whether you agree with him.
And I have a very different interpretation. I completely disagree with James's statement in that context. I guess because to me, the reason why I was a Marxist and the reason why I still think that Marxism actually does still have something to offer as a way of analysing what's occurring in our society today is the fundamental importance of social class. And I guess the reason why I still feel great loyalty to people in towns like Middlesbrough is because of the importance of kind of respecting, but I that's a terrible word to use, and I don't think it really gets across what I mean in terms of working class people. It's why I'm very critical. For example, I know I'm drifting off woke thinking a little bit for now, but be very critical of net zero policies, for example, because they tend to reinforce the deindustrialization of the Northeast, which is really taking away people's jobs, taking away people's livelihoods. These jobs have disappeared in the 1980s. They've not been replaced to any huge extent. So you have a lot of social problems then. And yet when you have woke identity politics comes in, actually, rather than defending the interests of working class people, it does the exact opposite. It tells particularly working class white men, let's be very blunt about it, that they are a problem.
Well, they're toxic.
Exactly.
All of them.
Yes. And that's my huge problem with woke thinking and the whole kind of identity politics hierarchy, if you like. It takes some people who I would argue can be already very privileged. I mean, if you're a young woman of colour, let's say, who's... well, I'm not naming names, but if you are a young woman of colour who's grown up in a posh London suburb, attended a posh private school...
A Fua Hirsch, as they said.
Is well connected, Oxbridge educated, I struggle to believe that you are really less privileged than a young white boy who's grown up on a council estate in Stockton-upon-Tees and is facing a life with very, very poor job prospects. And yet woke thinking would have us believe that one is the young black woman, let's be blunt, is the one who is oppressed in this situation. And that's my beef with woke. It overlooks entirely those class dynamics, and worse than just overlooking them, it tells us to do the exact opposite. It tells us that the white working class are a problem, and for me, that's not in any way Marxism. It's the opposite of Marxism. It takes everything that's positive about a Marxist analysis and completely trashes it.
Would another way then possibly be to analyze it as the emerging ideology of what George Orwell in Milan Dejas referred to as the new class?
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking particularly of Orwell's essay on James Burnham's theory about the emergence of the managerial class in the 1930s, which clearly influences 1984. But it seems to me this is an ideology that is enabling particularly middle-class elites to, both in the private and the big public, public sector institutions, to gain more and more power and control over society using a much more vaguely interpreted or defined type of authoritarianism.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. And it's the way of them gaining moral authority, moral legitimacy. So they can say, well, we are morally superior to you because we've bought into this way of thinking. We've got the correct values, the correct morals. That's what makes us better than you. And that's what gives us the power to tell you what to do. That's why we can be the people to make the hate speech laws, to dictate what type of lanyard you should wear to work. I can't remember who came up with it. I think it might have been Morris Gleisman, actually, and Janice Turner quoted him in an editorial in the Times last Saturday. I referred to them as the Lanyard Class, and I thought that was such an excellent phrase. I'm going to try and steal that and use that in any conversation in future. But this idea that these are people with the kind of the moral authority to rule over us and to essentially boss everybody else about.
And it justifies, I suppose, ever-expanding intervention, because you can just move from one micro intervention to another and say, well, the work is never done. We haven't achieved cultural equality, which is impossible to measure. I mean, much more difficult than, say, economic equality. So it's an ideology that is really advancing the material interests of a series of bourgeois elites.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think this is why they will not give up on this so readily. I mean, we can talk about whether wokes weren't being pushed back on, not being pushed back on. But essentially, because this is the source of their moral legitimacy, and their moral legitimacy then, exactly as you say, has very material benefits for them. I mean, just look purely in terms of the salaries that some of these people who are being paid, DEI officers working in the NHS can earn more than being a nurse. Or even being or
the Prime Minister.
Yes, exactly. I mean, if you have that higher salary and you're salary, your job, your prospects, the school your children go to, the house you live in is dependent upon this moral structure of woke thinking, you're not going to give up on that so readily. You're not going to give up on that without a fight or without actually being forced to. I think partly materially, as I said, in terms of salary, but I think it's also an existential question as well, because this is I don't think people are lying, I guess is what I'm trying to say. I don't think people wake up on the morning, people who have these jobs as DEI officers or, heads of Stonewall, head of these kind of charitable companies, Amnesty International, for example, who are also heavily promoting a trans rights agenda at the moment. I don't think they wake up in the morning and think something very different and then say, oh, do you know what, I will kind of put this on as a costume when I go to work. I will pretend to be woke because it's in my material interests. I think these people do come to believe what it is that they are saying. And so to actually then challenge that, it becomes an existential issue as well, for their kind of entire psychic sense of themselves.
You challenge them, you're messing with their budgets.
You are messing with their budgets.
And their pension plans.
But absolutely. But I guess the point I'm trying to make is that that's true and that's very, very important. But more than just a material proposition, it's also an existential threat to their sense of self as well. And not just their sense of self as individuals, but exactly what you were saying earlier, their sense of self as a class, as a powerful cultural elite. It's not a question of just a few individuals, but an entire class has come to adopt this moral outlook on the world. And so to push back on that challenges the belief system, the kind of intrinsic core of what this class of people has come to believe makes them morally superior to everybody else.
One of the things that drives me mad, I got to a time in life and I'm driven mad by, so many things. But one in particular is the way in which some commentators on the centre-right and some on the trad left, who are also anti-woke, nevertheless concede the idea that new left thinking, woke thinking, is in some way progressive, whereas I see it as an assault on, without wanting to sound too grandiose and pompous, Western civilization. I'd be interested to know whether you think I'm overstating.
No, not at all. Again, it's another reason why I wrote that whole book, because I think woke thinking is incredibly regressive. I think it rehabilitates racism, it rehabilitates sexism, it rehabilitates homophobia in ways that are incredibly backwards and unhelpful. And I think this is the one thing that I really hate is when people say, oh, I shouldn't have a problem with woke because it's just be kind, it's just be nice, it's just be friendly, it's just don't be a dick. People come out with all of these things. And well, if that was all it was, okay, I wouldn't have a problem with it. I wouldn't be writer to motivate an entire book just because I think you shouldn't be kind. I'm not that kind of mean-spirited person. And if it was just a kind of more extreme form of anti-racism or anti-sexism, again, I think it would be something that we could perhaps live with, but perhaps call into question the censorship, but the underlying philosophy you could live with. It's precisely because it is so regressive in every civil liberty, in every step towards equality, that I was motivated to spend all that time writing a book to challenge it. So, even just to take race as an example, I think the kind of for me, the pinnacle of anti-racism, and I guess I'm showing my age here, somebody who really grew up and became politically aware during the 1990s, but the idea of being anti-racist was to be colourblind. It was not to judge people by the colour of their skin, to take people for how you found them, to find out what people think about things, to be interested in people as individuals and not to treat groups as representatives of a skin colour. To me, that was the very definition of prejudice, was to see somebody's skin colour first of all, and then to make judgments about that person based upon the colour of their skin. And to be progressive was to move beyond that, not to judge people according to their skin colour. Whereas you look at people like Robin DiAngelo, for example, they are Abraham X. Kendi. They are telling us that I'm racist to make that kind of statement, and that we should see race. We should be judging people according to the colour of their skin. I should accept that I am a white person with white privilege, and other people are black people and they are oppressed because of their skin colour, and then we should play some complicated game where I'd somehow kind of acknowledge my privilege in their presence, and it becomes horrible. But this rehabilitates racial thinking. It forces us to see people as being representatives of skin colour first and foremost. I think the whole trans debate, is not only incredibly sexist and anti-feminist, it completely trashes women's rights, but it's also homophobic. It's saying that single-sex attraction, which is the very definition of homophobia, doesn't exist, that people are attracted to some mythical sense of gender identity. And so gay people, lesbians who are saying, no, I'm actually attracted to a female body, have somehow, they're wrong. They need re-educating. That to be very crude, having sex with a man will correct them. That's to be blunt what's being said. And these things were last heard 100 years ago. These are terribly sexist and homophobic statements, and yet woke thinking brings all of this back. I think it's very damaging.
And on another level, it also seems to me very reactionary, because it's challenging the whole idea of where knowledge comes from and how knowledge, which advances humankind, can be developed. Because it says that knowledge comes through the prism of lived experience linked to identity groups rather than through a scientific method. I don't know if you
absolutely.
comment on that.
Yes, no, absolutely. One of the biggest concerns I have in terms of education is with the decolonize movement. This idea that every subject you study at school or at university, museums, art galleries, they need decolonizing somehow. And you break this down, what's actually meant by that is that, for one thing, let's just be clear, this is not a suggestion that, we're a continuation of the colonialism of the mid 20th century. We've long since moved on from that geographically. What's being said is that colonialism still exists in people's minds, essentially. Colonialism still exists in our cultural institutions, in the language that we use, in the books that we read, in the curriculum that children learn at school, in a canon of English literature. And what that really means is Western thinking. A Western culture is somehow inherently wrong, inherently colonialist. So this is where you see attacks on Shakespeare, attacks on Charles Dickens, Plato, Aristotle. It's about decentering the Western intellectual tradition, undermining the legacy of the intellectual legacy of the Enlightenment, calling all of these things into question. I don't think these intellectual gains should be set in aspic, they should not be unquestionable. But at the same time, I don't see what's to be gained just for trashing them for the sake of trashing them. I mean, we still read and watch Shakespeare plays 500 years after his death because they speak to something very important in our common humanity. They speak to a universalism. They're performed all around the world. In almost every country of the world, there are statues to Shakespeare. And yet the UK, England, Shakespeare's birthplace, is the one country where it's now called into question.
Well, it's even the Shakespeare Trust or whatever it is, which is meant to keep his legacy alive, is now trashing his legacy. So that is pretty extraordinary.
It really, really is. And if you had to explain this to somebody who kind of had suddenly come down from another planet or had been brought back from 100 years ago, that Stratford-upon-Avon, Shakespeare's birthplace, was kind of decrying his works as some symbolism of Western superiority, of white superiority, and was unable to celebrate the beauty of Shakespeare's language, the universality of his drama, and that instead we should go around kind of doffing our caps and being ashamed to be associated with these things. I don't know how you would be able to explain that to somebody. I don't think they would make any sense of it at all. But I think it does come back to what you're saying, where this is the Philistinism, I think, of woke thinking, that the only way we can judge the worth of something is according to the identity of the person who produced it. So Shakespeare's bad because Shakespeare was a white man, whereas we can look at work by other artists, and if they have been produced by Black men, brown women, they must inherently be more deserving of a place because they have been historically underrepresented. Now, I think there may well be arguments to be made there. I don't want to say, we construct a school curriculum that is exclusively based upon the works of white men. I wouldn't say that. I guess my argument would be that we should be looking at the intellectual merit of what's on offer. And that should form the basis of a school curriculum, of what's in museums, of what's in art galleries. I think we need to judge the worth of what's being said or the beauty of the art that's been produced, rather than the starting point being the identity of the producer. I think that's when we run into huge problems, when we take that as our starting point. It just leads us down a path of complete Philistinism. The only thing I would add to that is that, what concerns me also increasingly, and this also has a political resonance, and again, I suppose it takes me back to Middlesbrough, to my birthplace, and to thinking about people who are now growing up in towns like that. I do think that having something to be proud of in relation to your nation or in relation to your community is actually very, very important. And for all I'm saying, and I stand by, I'm not trying to contradict what I've just said about the importance of judging something on its intellectual merit. But I think you do also want to tip the balance to saying, we are England. This is Britain, the United Kingdom. And actually having things that we can, or people, historical figures we can feel proud of, is in and of itself an important thing to do. So where I grew up, Middlesbrough, Captain Cook was the big historical.
I was going to bring him up, actually. Yeah, but
he was the big historical figure. There was Captain Cook Birthplace Museum down the road from where I grew up. The local shopping centre was named the Captain Cook Centre. I don't think they've actually managed to do it, but I did see a news report just the other day that the name of the centre, the Captain Cook Shopping Centre, it has now been put up for some kind of review. They want to rename it. And you just know, you're reading, I can't remember the exact things from this article, but it will be some kind of name that's planned to be so inoffensive. The Square, I think they now want to call it.
Well, it could be worse, couldn't it? They might call it, the Winnie Mandela Memorial. sentence of
I suspect there already is one of those, that name's taken. But, if they call it the square, there's no local attachment there. Nobody can feel proud of the square. There's no sense of history. It's a year zero mentality.
Well, that is the point, isn't it? That they are trying to rewire the culture because they believe as postmodernists, going back to our earlier conversation about Marxism, who were, whatever you think of Marxists, they were materialists, and their ideology was founded on a particular interpretation of material reality.
Yeah.
These people believe that it's the culture that needs to be subjected to state ownership in order to bring about the revolutionary change they want to see. So, of course, they want to control every aspect of thought and speech. I want to read you a quote, which I find fascinating, by a Labour MP called Nadia Whittome, which to me epitomizes how sinister and potentially anti-democratic this emerging ideology is. I mean, she said, speaking specifically of the transgender issue, we must not fetishize, difficult word to say, debate, as though debate is itself an innocuous, neutral act. The very act of debate is an effective rollback of assumed equality and a foot in the door for doubt and hatred. Well, what are the implications of that?
No, absolutely. I mean, the implication of it is that an elite, a small elite group of people decide what's what and foist it upon the rest of us. And if we make any attempt to discuss or express any view on what they have told us we should think, then we are hateful beings here. But and this has been a well-established view, and it's for a number of years now amongst cultural elite circles, particularly within academia. And it's prompted an awful lot of censorship, the whole idea of the safe space on a university campus, and the whole no debate idea, which was driven by Stonewall, particularly in relation to trans movement. Any attempt at discussing the whole notion of competing rights, the idea that if you allow male-bodied people into female spaces and it's no longer a single-sex space, any attempt to discuss that, we were told, and I was no platformed from a speech I was going to give at our university in London on the basis of arguing on this exact basis, where I was told you're kind of not just denying the right of transgender people to exist, but almost as if I was, I forget the exact phrase they used now, but almost as if I was some kind of trying to initiate some kind of holocaust of transgender people, simply by saying, is there something we should talk about here? Perhaps there are competing rights, but that was kind of testament to mass murder, denying the existence of transgender people. And I think with the Supreme Court ruling we've had recently, it just shows how spectacularly this whole policy of no debate has backfired for them. I mean, it's been, I would say, one of the biggest political failures. Thank goodness. I mean, free speech advocates like myself, a free speech absolutist, I would describe myself as, said all along that the reason why you want free speech is to be able to have these arguments out, to have these discussions, to get these issues out in the open, that you don't make bad ideas go away by just wishing them away or by silencing them. The only way to challenge bad ideas is actually to have them out in the open. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. And the truth of that is now being shown in everything that's happening since.
I think there's a danger that the contemporary left is actually a sort of proto-fascistic movement. I mean, not only in its instinctive desire to suppress freedom of speech, but the way in which, as you described a few moments ago, it divides up society into groups who are defined as being either virtuous or oppressor. I mean, this is a sort of repeat of the Nazi theorist Carl Schmitt, his theory of enemies and friends within a society. And it seems to me they're just repeating that. I mean, they might choose different groups to define as being virtuous or having victimhood. Though in some cases, particularly increasingly with Jewish people, there seems to be an overlap. And I don't think that's coincidental.
No.
But so I don't know. Do you think there's a danger this movement, if the momentum continues? I'm not saying they're there now, but...
No, I think there are a number of differences. I mean, for one thing, I think just instinctively, I always react against using the word fascism, even proto-fascism, neo-fascism, however you want to describe it. I hate it when people on the other side do that, to anything I say.
Yes, but you're not a fascist.
No, I know. But I think, it's become almost like a joke on the internet. You're 8 steps away in any argument for someone referring to Hitler. And I just instinctively don't like using those historical terms because I think there's a specificity to historical terms, particularly when we start talking about the Nazi era and references to Hitler. And I do worry that when we reference fascism, we could be leading down the same trap, and we want to avoid that. I think we have to be very specific about the situation we find ourselves in today. I think the other thing that I think is a very, very important difference that makes me hopeful and gives me optimism and has kind of buoyed me on for the past few years is I think there is no mass buy-in for these ideas. So I think that's always going to put a limit on how successful these people can be. Where I do agree with you is that there is an incredible authoritarianism behind it. And in that quotation that you read out from Nadia Whittome, that completely reveals the authoritarianism. You give these people the power to censor. You give these people the power to regulate our behaviour. And they, let's be honest, they have had this power to censor. They have had this power to regulate our behaviour. And they love that. I mean, I think they're never happier than donning the lanyard, telling other people what to do, and enforcing a regime of censorship and silencing of dissent. But I think the reason why they almost have to have that authoritarianism behind their agenda is precisely because there is not the mass buy-in. I think you could still go on the Clapham omnibus or, go into any random pub in any random town in Britain, and you are going to find people who are sensible, level-headed, know that a woman is an adult human female, know that it's racist to judge people according to their skin colour, are very sensible.
How long are they going to be able to have that conversation? Because we now see there's going to be legislation, the anti-bants law, as it's called, whereby actually conversations in pubs and football stadiums and any other sort of place that human beings gather could result in legal action. But this leads me on to ask you a question about something else you've written, which is your paper for Civitas called Policing Hate, because hate speech is, for me, the key device used to suppress freedom of speech and bring about this sort of cultural revolution. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about that paper and what your fundamental argument is there.
Yeah. So, I mean, my reason for writing the paper was because, as I said, I describe myself as a free speech absolutist, and hate speech seems to be one of the ways in which censorship is most being enforced today, whether that's on social media, newspapers, and, as you say, even potentially regular conversation in pubs and in the workplace. But I think the point I was trying to make in that paper, and the thing I think is most important to get across, is that it's just a a thoroughly political concept. There is no objective notion of hate speech, as far as I'm concerned. What I might hate might be how I might define or what I might consider to be hateful is very different to what another person might consider to be hateful. These are not objective categories, these are subjective categories. Hate is a human emotion, after all. Love, hate, all of these things. It would be bizarre if we all hated the same thing. And so the idea that you can then make laws to outlaw hate, of a subjective emotion, these then become political concepts, the political laws that are trying to outlaw basically one side of a political debate. So you saw this a lot in the aftermath of last year's riots, where the initial response was to round up people who had tweeted sentiment, which, a lot of it was things that I would very, very strongly disagree with. But again, you need to have the argument. I mean, talk of burning down mosques, for example. I mean, these are horrible, horrible things to say. But I don't think they should be against the law. You need to be able to see who thinks these things. You need to be able to explore why they think it. I mean, to be very pedantic, clearly there should be laws against incitement. If you were holding a gun now and pointing it at someone's head, I don't think it would be acceptable for me to say, go ahead, shoot, and to incite you to go ahead and actually shoot another person. But that was not what was going on in the angry tweets that were being sent at the time of the riots. It was a more general horrible sentiment. I'd be the first to admit, an absolutely horrible sentiment that I did not like, was very ugly, was not great to see, and pointed to some real social problems, I think, that we have in this society at the moment. But the idea that you just ban those things, round up the people who said them, put them all in prison for longer, let's be honest, than many people who actually committed violent crimes on those in those few weeks, I think is it's a heavy-handed way, an authoritarian way of trying to solve a political problem.
We're getting sort of two-tier speech then, aren't we? I mean, what I'd call, maybe in my overblown way, speech apartheid. But it seems to me that the new left can say anything they like, quite rightly, about you or me or whoever they happen to disagree with. They can call Kemi Badenoch whatever they want to, use whatever racial epithets they have used in relation to her, like calling her a coconut and what have you. But that's fine, according to Keir Starmer. But I mean, if you say anything that transgresses the key kind of shibboleths of the woke movement, then you can find yourself being visited by the cops, or worse, actually sent to jail. So, I mean, this is another manifestation, isn't it, of two-tier Britain?
Yes, and I think for me the best example of this really were the marches, pro-Gaza, pro-Palestine marches that we saw taking place in London in the weeks after the pogrom of October the 7th. Week after week after week, we had people marching through London, some of them with the most incredibly hateful anti-Semitic placards and anti-Semitic slogans being chanted, with barely an arrest, barely a police officer rolling an eye at such sentiment being expressed. And yet, as you pointed out right at the beginning of our conversation, Mark, we're looking to introduce new legislation to define Islamophobia in such a way that even pointing out, the grooming gangs in northern England were predominantly men of Pakistani Muslim heritage would be in and of itself considered problematic, let's say, potentially warranting a knock on the door by a police officer. So why should those two things coexist? Why is it acceptable to march through the streets of London making anti-Semitic statements, but you can't even name the group of people who are responsible for raping 12-year-old girls? I mean, I know that's very stark and a very blunt way of putting it, but I think that's the double standard that we're facing.
Moving to a conclusion, I'd be interested to know how you think, on a sort of positive note, those of us who are free speech absolutists should fight back. What is the strategy for you?
Well, I think as an individual, I always try and say exactly what I think and exactly what I mean in every circumstance. And if the police want to arrest me for anything I've said, you kind of bring it on. I'd be up for the fight. And I do think that's very, very important, because I think what these woke authoritarians would like more than anything else is for us to self-censor, for us to almost preempt laws that are going to come into effect, or imagine a regime that's far tougher than it actually is, and monitor, self-police, self-monitor, have these conversations in pubs and be telling each other, shh, watch what you say, be careful, don't say that out loud. Well, I think we've got to do the opposite to that. It's very important that we do say what we think, and we do use language that we think is appropriate, and we do that in the pub and on social media, and we say what we think and we say what we mean. I think that's a very, very important principle. And like I say, they can't arrest all of us, surely. We know there's a huge problem with prison overcrowding. They're not going to arrest us all if we all say what we think. So I think that's very, very important. But I mean, I guess I feel some optimism in many ways in the kind of populist revolt that seems to be brewing with the election of reform, which is not to say I'm a Nigel Farage fangirl. I'm not a
You don't really look like the sort of type of person who would be.
Well, I don't think you can say that there's a type of person, Mark. I mean, I'm a proud citizen of Kent now, and Kent County Council went reform in the local elections, and I was pleased to see that. And I think there's not. I think maybe a couple of years ago there would have been a type who you could identify with reform, but I genuinely don't think that's the case now. I think the party that's capable of winning seats in Kent and in, Hartlepool is a party that's truly speaking to a cross-section of the population. But if I look at individual reform policies, I could pick out faults with them and things I disagree with. But I think what's really important for me in the next kind of coming electoral cycle, is to have a genuinely populist party in place that essentially rips a lot of stuff up, rip up net zero, rip up hate speech legislation, rip up the Equalities Act. And I think we need a bonfire of the last 25 years worth at least of policies. And I think if you can get a party that can come in on a populist wave and rip up everything that's been passed within the past 25 years, all the woke authoritarianism needs absolutely clearing out, then they've done us a huge, huge favour.
So you're still really a revolutionary, but in a good way, which leads me on to my
Mark,
very
I've always been a revolutionary in a good way.
Well, that's a matter of interpretation, but this leads me to my very last question, which sort of connects to some of the stuff you've just been saying. But I ask everybody this. If you had a Trump-like executive order superpower, what is the specific measure you would either introduce or get rid of?
Do you know what? This is difficult to answer because there are so many. I would be such a great dictator. For all I'm slamming authoritarianism, I would have so many authoritarian policies I would want to introduce. Well, ban, for example. I mean, I would ban the use of the phrase transgender children. There is absolutely no such thing as a transgender child. No infant is born in this world in the wrong body. You know, if you're a baby boy, you're a boy. If you're a baby girl, you're a girl. There is no baby girl born in a boy's body and no baby boy born in a girl's body, you know. And we should just absolutely, I would just completely outlaw that phrase. And then I would move from there to get politics out of school. At the moment, get politics out of school would mean kids have absolutely nothing to do between 9 o'clock in the morning and 3 o'clock in the afternoon, because it is all politics. As far as, 90% of it is politics, with a few bits tinkering around the edges. Those would be my first two: ban the phrase transgender child and get politics out of schools. And then I'd carry on from there.
On that note, thank you so much for talking to me. It's been fascinating as always.
Thank you for having me. Real pleasure.